In Christianity, the collegiate church is a church where the daily office of worship is maintained by a college of canons, a non-monastic or secular community of clergy, organized as a self-governing corporate body, which may be presided over by a dean or provost. In its governance and religious observance, a collegiate church is similar to a cathedral, although a collegiate church is not the seat of a bishop and has no diocesan responsibilities. Collegiate churches were often supported by extensive lands held by the church, or by tithe income from appropriated benefices. They commonly provide distinct spaces for congregational worship and for the choir offices of the clerical community. History. In the early medieval period, before the development of the parish system in Western Christianity, many new church foundations were staffed by groups of secular priests, living a communal life and serving an extensive territory. In England, these churches were termed minsters, from the Latin monasterium, although confusingly only a few were strictly monastic. In the 9th and 10th centuries, many such churches adopted formal rules of governance, commonly derived from those composed by Chrodegang of Metz for Metz Cathedral, and thenceforth came to be described as collegiate, and there were also new foundations of this type. For the 11th century onwards, the richer collegiate churches tended to be provided with new statutes establishing the priests of the college as canons within a formal chapter, such that each canon was supported by a separate endowment, or prebend, such canons being termed prebendaries. In less affluent foundations, the pooled endowments of the community were apportioned between the canons, such canons being termed portioners. Both prebendaries and portioners tended in this period to abandon communal living, each canon establishing his own house within the precinct of the church, in response to which, and generally on account of widespread concern that the religious life of collegiate communities might be insufficiently rigorous, many collegiate foundations in the 12th century adopted the Augustinian rule and become fully monastic, as for example at Dorchester Abbey and Christchurch Priory. Because each prebend provided a discrete source of income, in the later medieval period prebendaries increasingly tended to be non-resident, paying a vicar to undertake divine service in the place. Kings and bishops came to regard prebends as useful sources of income for favored servants and supporters, and it was not uncommon for a bishop or archbishop also to hold half a dozen or more collegiate prebends or deaneries. For the 13th century onwards, existing collegiate foundations also attracted chantry endowments, usually a legacy in a will providing for masses to be sung for the repose of the souls of the testator and the families by the collegiate clergy, or the vicars. The same impetus to establish endowed prayer also led to many new collegiate foundations in this later period, under which the rectory of an existing parish church would be appropriated to the new chantry college, and a new organizational structure was developed for these bodies, by which endowment income was held collectively, and each canon received a fixed stipend conditional on being personally resident, such canons being termed fellows, led by a warden. Chantry colleges still maintained the daily divine office with the additional prime function of offering masses in intercession for departed members of the founder's family, but also typically served charitable or educational purposes, such as providing hospitals or schools. One particular development of the chantry college principle was the establishment in university cities of collegiate foundations in which the fellows were graduate academics and university teachers. Local parish churches were appropriate created to these foundations, thereby initially acquiring collegiate status. However, this form of college developed radically in the later Middle Ages after the pattern of New College, Oxford, where for the first time college residence was extended to include undergraduate students. Thereafter, university collegiate bodies developed into a distinct type of religious establishment whose regular worship took place in dedicated college chapels rather than in collegiate churches, and in this form they survived the Reformation in England in the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, as also did the associated collegiate schools and chapels of Eton College and Winchester College. In a collegiate church, a chapel, as in a cathedral, the canons or fellows are typically seated separately from any provision for a lay congregation. In choir stalls parallel with the south and north walls facing inwards rather than towards the altar at the eastern end. This has influenced the design of other churches in that the singing choir is seen as representing the idea of a college. The Westminster model of parliamentary seating arrangement arose from Parliament's use of the collegiate St. Stephen's Chapel, Westminster for its sittings, until Westminster Palace burned down in 1834. Contemporary examples. 3 traditional collegiate churches have survived in England since the Middle Ages: at Westminster Abbey in London, St George's Chapel of Windsor Castle, and at St Endelian's Church in Cornwall. The idea of a collegiate church has continued to develop a contemporary equivalent. Many contemporary collegiate churches draw on the idea that collegiate means a church with more than one minister, often understood as reflected in the priesthood of all believers, and local, congregational governance. 2 different examples of contemporary collegiate churches in America today are the Collegiate Church of New York City, and St. Paul's Collegiate Church at Storrs P, Connecticut. The churches of the former include the Marble Collegiate Church, founded in 1628, and the Middle Collegiate, Fort Washington Collegiate, and West End Collegiate churches, affiliated with the Reformed Church in America. St. Paul's Collegiate Church at Storrs features contemporary architecture reflecting traditional collegiate church architecture. Unlike most historical collegiate churches, this is a non-denominational, evangelical church. According to church leaders, they chose the name collegiate to emphasize the priesthood of all believers, and that every member of the body of Christ is a minister. While collegiate churches typically have its seating arranged parallel with the south and north walls, facing inwards rather than towards the altar at the eastern end, St. Paul's Collegiate Church has adapted this by creating a chapel fully in the round with the altar communion station in the center. In the Catholic Church, most cathedrals possess a cathedral chapter and thus collegiate churches. The number of collegiate chapters other than those of cathedrals has been greatly reduced compared to times past. 3 of them are in Rome: the 2 papal basilicas St. Peter and St. Mary Major, plus the Basilica St. Maria ad Martyrs. Otherwise, 3 can be found in Germany, to wit: St. Martin's Church, Landshut, SDS, Philip and Jacob in Altötting, and St. Remigius in Borken. In Portugal, the one example that survives is that of the ancient Real Colegiada of Nossa Senhora da Oliveira in Guimarães. One collegiate church can be found in the Czech Republic, SDS, Peter and Paul in Prague v. Sered. Historical examples. England. In pre-Reformation England, there were usually a number of collegiate churches in each diocese, with several hundred in total. They were mostly abolished during the reign of Edward VI of England in 1547 as part of the Reformation by the Act for the Dissolution of Collegiate Churches and Chantries. Almost all continue to serve as parish churches with a resident rector, vicar, a curate, or although the appointment of a vicar in succession to the priestly services of the Augustinian priory at St. Paul's Church, Bedford predates this by 19 years. Two major collegiate churches, however, Manchester and Southwell, were refounded with a collegiate body after the Reformation, and these were joined by the revived college at Ripon in 1604, all three churches maintaining choral foundations for daily worship. These three churches became cathedrals in the 19th century. Hence, at the beginning of the 20th century, the royal peculiars alone survived with a functioning non-cathedral and non-academic collegiate body. The colleges of Oxford and Cambridge universities, and the schools of Eton and Winchester, successfully resisted dissolution at the Reformation, arguing that the chantry origins had effectively been subsumed within the continuing academic and religious functions, and pleading that they be permitted simply to cease maintaining the chantries and obituaries. For the most part, they had already ceased to undertake collegiate worship in their appropriated churches, which reverted to normal parish status, as for example at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, Bridge North. The chapel of Merton College, Oxford, however, continued to serve as a collegiate church until 1891, just as the chapel of Christ Church, Oxford, doubles as the Cathedral of Oxford to this day. The Church of St. Mary Magdalene, Newark-on-Trent, though never collegiate in the medieval period, maintained a choral foundation for collegiate worship after the Reformation in association with the Magnus Bequest, an arrangement that continued till 1901. Otherwise, 12 colleges survived the Reformation in England and Wales in nominal form. In some cases these were refoundations under Queen Mary. In other cases, they may simply have been overlooked by the suppression commissioners. Unlike at Manchester, Ripon and Southwell, these churches did not continue to maintain regular collegiate worship, but the prebends of parishioners persisted as non-resident sinecures, and as such were almost all finally dissolved by the Cathedrals Act 1840. However, the Victorian legislators themselves overlooked the College of St. Andelian in Cornwall, and this uniquely continues to this day, having in 1929 been provided with new statutes that re-established non-resident unpaid prebends and an annual chapter. In England at the end of the 20th century there were 16 churches or chapels with the title of Royal Peculiar, not all of which were still in regular use for worship. Of these only 2 are collegiate, each with a dean and a chapter of 4 secular canons. The Collegiate Church of St. Peter, Westminster, and St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, Ireland. In Ireland, there are a number of ancient churches still in regular use that are collegiate churches. Most notably, the church known as St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin is a collegiate church. St. Mary's Collegiate Church in Youghal, founded 1220, County Cork, a building of very remote antiquity, home to a fine choir, the Clerks' Choral. St. Nicholas's Collegiate Church in Galway, founded in 1320 and granted collegiate status in 1484, is another fine example of a pre-Reformation collegiate church. Scotland, the church now referred to as St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, became a collegiate church in 1466, less than a century before the Scottish Reformation. Wales, St. Peter's Collegiate Church, Ruthin, was built by John de Grey in 1310, following the erection of Ruthin Castle by his father, Reginald de Grey, in 1277. For some time before this, Ruthin had been the home of a nunnery and a prior. From 1310 to 1536, St. Peter's was a collegiate church served by a warden and 7 priests. Following the dissolution of the college, its work was restored on a new pattern by Gabriel Goodman, a Ruthin man who became Dean of Westminster in 1561. Goodman re-established Ruthin School in 1574 and refounded the almshouses of Christ's Hospital, together with the wardenship of Ruthin in 1590. Since then, St. Peter's has continued as a parochial and collegiate church with its warden, church wardens and parochial church council. A close relationship is maintained between the church Ruthin School and the almshouses of Christ's Hospital. St. Padan's Church, Llanbadarn was a collegiate church, having originally been founded as a class church by St. Padan, after whom it was named, in the early 6th century. The church had been the seat of a bishop during the years immediately following St. Padan, who was its first bishop. The church was refounded as a cell of St. Peter's, Gloucester, by Gilbert Fitzrichard. Monastic life at Llanbadarn was short-lived, for the Welsh drove the English monks away when they reconquered Cardigan. The priory later became a college of priests. Thomas Bradwardine, later briefly Archbishop of Canterbury, was rector of Llanbadarn 1347 to 1349, and thereafter the abbot of the Cistercian Vale Royal Abbey, Chester, was ex officio rector 1360 to 1538. The old bishop's palaces at Abergwili, home to the Bishop of St. David's since 1542. When Bishop William Barlow transferred his palace from St. David's to Abergwili, reusing the premises of an older college of priests. The building is believed to have been built between 1283 and 1291, when Thomas Beck was made Bishop of St. David's. It was known as a college until it was amalgamated with the Dominican friary now known as Christ's College, Brecon, refounded as a public school in 1541. It was almost completely rebuilt in 1903 following a disastrous fire. It contains the chapel originally added by Archbishop Laud in 1625, when he was Bishop of St. David's. In 1974 the old episcopal palace was purchased by Carmarthenshire County Council for use as a museum, whilst a new residence for the bishops, Lees Esgob, was built in part of the grounds, together with diocesan offices, thereby continuing a connection with Abergwili which has now lasted for well over 400 years. St. Syby's Collegiate and Parish Church, Holyhead, was another collegiate church, as was the Collegiate and Parish Church of St. Mary, St. Mary's Square, Swansea.